During his visit to Israel following the October 7th attacks, U.S. President Joe Biden warned the country not to repeat the mistakes the U.S. made in response to the 9/11 attacks. But is Israel doing just that?
Nobody, especially Trump, knows it yet. It was with this phrase that Michael Moore began his statement, which was quickly dubbed the dumbest statement of the year. Whether this is justified is up to you to decide.
Can a Broadway show bring down a sitting president? It was a theory I had, a question, and I thought, well, why not? Let's give it a try. We've tried everything else since January.
Here's hair and makeup.
Michael Moore began criticizing Donald Trump back in 2016, when Trump was just beginning his bid for the U.S. presidency. At the time, amid all the frenzy of news and rumors, Moore was probably the only one who saw Trump not just as a strange candidate, but as a real threat. In his documentary Trumpland, which he released right in the middle of the presidential race, Moore not only predicted Trump's victory, but also unceremoniously explained why his approach to politics was not only a disaster for America, but possibly for the entire world. This, of course, caused an uproar among Trump supporters, but they were probably too busy tweeting to realize that what they were watching was a prediction, not another Hollywood blockbuster.
Michael Moore, you predicted he would win, and you were in a minority. Are you predicting yet that he will go?
No, he's not going anywhere. These Republicans seem to have no interest in impeaching him, and I'm sure they've already done the polling and surveying their districts.
What was particularly amusing about this film was how Moore, as if he were clairvoyant, predicted that this individual, whose ideas would be more suited to an advertising campaign for inexpensive blankets, could actually become president. And contrary to common sense, this came to pass. Moore tried to explain how Trump uses all these populist tricks, promises to build a wall, catchy slogans that in a normal world would be perceived as absurd. But in the US, they somehow worked, and Moore was like, "Don't say I didn't warn you."
Donald Trump came to the Detroit Economic Club and stood there in front of the Ford Motor executives and said, if you close these factories as you're planning to do in Detroit and build them in Mexico, I'm going to put a 35% tariff on those cars when you send them back, and nobody's going to buy them.
After the film's release, Moore did not stop. He decided not to limit himself to one film and continued his critical activities through all possible channels. He appeared on television, wrote articles, and shouted loudly on social media. His public statements constantly echoed the same theme. Trump is not just a president, he is a man who is destroying the foundations of American democracy. And while Moore could have played with the rhetoric a little and said that Trump might not understand what he was doing, he immediately dismissed that myth. No, Trump knew what he was doing, and he was destroying democracy to the fullest extent possible. Moore pointed out that all these eccentric antics, such as strange decisions on the environment, disregard for human rights, or behavior on the international stage, were actually part of one big picture. A picture where Trump was not looking for solutions to problems, but rather dramatizing them to look like a hero who was supposedly fighting the enemies of the nation. Moore, of course, viewed all this with sarcasm. As someone who had probably encountered politicians willing to turn even the most serious issues into a spectacle many times in his career, but never expected the spectacle to be so absurd. In short, Michael Moore did not simply criticize Trump. He exposed the theater of the absurd in which Trump was the director, and America was the backdrop. Moore questioned the very concept of democracy when a man with no experience, or for that matter common sense, easily turns the political process into a show rather than a real solution to problems. Against this backdrop, Moore's criticism was perceived as almost the last cry of common sense in a country where show business has long replaced real politics.
Trump did not fall out of the sky. Trump is the result of decades of behavior on the part of corporate America, our political system, the whole shebang that gave us Trump. You know, one of the important ingredients of getting Donald Trump as president is first dumbing down the country to accept somebody like that as president of the United States.
Michael Moore, of course, wasn't one to just sit back and watch Trump put on a show. He immediately got down to business, organizing protests and actively engaging his fans in political activism. You could say that Moore became a kind of political fitness trainer for those who believed that sitting at home and venting their frustration online was not the best solution. He organized demonstrations, encouraging people to take to the streets and actively fight against what he considered a threat to the country. If there were an Olympic sport for fighting populism, Moore would surely take first place. Throughout Trump's career, Moore remained his most vocal and outspoken critic, making it clear to everyone that he had no intention of shutting up. His criticism became increasingly harsh and outspoken with each passing year, as if he had decided to do his job in such a way that Trump couldn't fail to hear him. Moore began to declare in all seriousness that Trump was doomed, that his downfall was inevitable. Downfall, of course, not in the literal sense, but political death, definitely. In response to the criticism, he simply smiled and said that no one believed him? Well, that just proves that Moore's predictions have a special magic. Better not to believe him, and then say, "We told you so."
What are you going to do about it?
This makes no sense.
What are you going to do about it?
Well, what I and millions of others are doing, we are going to be active every single day. We're starting with these first 100 days. We're calling it 100 Days of Resistance. And every day we are going to be doing various actions, and we're going to be encouraging people around the country.
Michael Moore never tires of reminding everyone that Donald Trump is not just a president, but a man consumed by his own narcissism and incapable of understanding the consequences of his actions. Moore asserts that Trump will continue down this path unabated, shocking and frightening people like a teenager who accidentally sets the curtains on fire in his house, but doesn't seem to notice how it might end. For Moore, Trump is not just a president, but a self-assured destroyer who, confident that he is striking blows against his enemies, is actually tearing himself apart. Every decision, every word and action is like acid, only deepening the wounds he has already inflicted on the country. And in the end, those wounds will not only bleed, but poison the entire political landscape. Moore paints Trump as a man who is simply incapable of moderation. He constantly seeks new conflicts, convincing himself that he can't give up, despite the catastrophic consequences for everyone around him. But for Moore, Trump is not just a conflicted politician, but a real chief gravedigger whose behavior threatens the lives of thousands of Americans. And of course, Moore does not miss the opportunity to say that Trump does not realize that he himself is creating the conditions for his inevitable downfall. According to Moore, those around him are not helping, but rather pushing him toward his final collapse. His sociopathic aides and fanatical MAGA followers are like a group of people who, seeing Trump destroying everything around him, are pushing him even further into the abyss. And Trump, of course, doesn't notice this because it's obviously more convenient for him to believe that he's always right than to realize that his actions are leading to absolute destruction. Michael Moore reflects with alarm and concern on the fate of Donald Trump, realizing that despite the temporary impossibility of ending his reign immediately, it is impossible to give up. He admits that watching what has been happening since Trump's inauguration has been difficult. Every day in the US has been filled with destructive actions that have literally eroded the foundations of democracy. This was not just a disappointment, it was a deliberate attack on the foundations of society that was difficult to accept. Moore asserts that Trump has made fatal mistakes that are gradually leading him to a catastrophic end. These mistakes, in his opinion, reflect not just political naivety, but a true original sin of megalomania. His belief that he is not just a president, but something more than an ordinary person. His belief in his own divine power, that he is king, and elections are no longer necessary, has become the very dangerous illusion that is slowly but surely leading him to his downfall. Moore believes that Trump's supporters, being completely devoted to him, do not realize where this path is leading. Even if they are shown facts and evidence, they will not be able to accept the truth because it contradicts their belief in their leader too much.
Drilling every day. Every day there's some crazy drilling.
I think it's Trump's friends in the construction business. There's a guy jackhammering up like 15 floors up right next to my head at all times.
Yes, right, you hear it every day.
That's all I...
For Moore, this whole picture is not just a political mistake, but a tragedy. He sees how the inability to act, the detachment, and the constant defeats of those who should have resisted have led the country down a path from which it is now difficult to return. And despite Trump's outward confidence, Moore is certain that his downfall is inevitable. Michael Moore continues to reveal the consequences of how Donald Trump's actions have brought the country to a point where democratic foundations have begun to crumble. He describes how Trump, realizing his power, launched a vicious attack on anything that could stand in his way. Trump began acting as if he had a plan for a coup, with massive attacks on the law, the Constitution, and anyone who dared to object. These steps were so rapid and aggressive that it became clear that the country was on the brink, and that democratic values were no longer sacred. Moore asserts that Trump was willing to do anything to achieve his goal, including using the armed forces to arrest political opponents. Trump's vengeful, cruel character became not just a hypothesis, but a reality that began to take shape. Trump's appointment of Supreme Court justices was the moment that gave him free rein. This decision allowed Trump to act without fear of consequences, believing that the laws were now optional for him and that no one could stop him.
Thanks for having me back.
What do you mean by that the Democrats don't take Trump seriously at their own peril?
Well, I've taken him seriously. I mean, I felt last fall that he would be the Republican nominee. I think that a lot of people just treat it as a joke, and yes, it's funny, and I laugh and all.
Trump plunged the country into shock, and this shock therapy paralyzed the entire opposition. Liberals, Democrats, and independents were completely confused, not knowing how to deal with this attack, which seemed impossible to prevent. For many of them, what was happening seemed unreal. It was not just a political struggle, but something much more destructive and tragic. Moore describes the panic of people who lost the ability not only to act, but also to think. So strong was the blow to their confidence that the U.S. was a country where everything had its system and limitations. Through people's emotional experiences, Moore conveys the picture of fear that gripped the country. The feeling of helplessness that suddenly overwhelmed citizens resembles a general sense that there is nowhere to run and no one who can help. People found themselves face to face with a political reality that seemed unimaginable just a short time ago.
None of what he said was true, but that didn't matter. He knew how to communicate to the American public. He knew how to tell them what they wanted to hear. He went all over Wisconsin the last week saying, I'm gonna make you all rich. I'm gonna make you all rich. You're gonna make you all rich. Well, geez, who wouldn't like to hear that?
Michael Moore continues to fiercely expose the consequences of Donald Trump's actions, which, in his opinion, have brought the country to a point where democratic foundations are beginning to crumble. Moore describes Trump as a man who realized his power and decided to use it without any restrictions. He didn't just start acting. He launched a brutal attack on everything that could get in his way, from the law and the Constitution to anyone who dared to challenge him. All these actions, so swift and aggressive, literally destroyed stability, and it became clear that the country was on the brink, and the values that had once been considered fundamental were no longer unshakable.
And I did have a couple of things, to say that were extremely controversial. And between JD and Melania and anybody else that heard, please, sir, it's such a beautiful unifying speech. Please, sir, don't say these things. I said, I'm telling you, it's going to play great. For this group of people, it's going to play great.
Moore claims that Trump is willing to do anything to achieve his goals, including using armed forces to arrest his political opponents. According to Moore, Trump's vengeful and cruel nature is not a fantasy, but a reality that has already begun to materialize. One of the most striking examples of this was Trump's appointment of Supreme Court justices, which gave him absolute freedom of action. This decision became the gateway through which he passed to act without fear of consequences, completely ignoring laws that, in his view, no longer mattered. For the country, it was a shock. At that moment, Trump's shock therapy paralyzed the entire opposition, leaving liberals, Democrats, and independents in complete disarray. They were unprepared for such an attack that seemed impossible and unreal. Moore depicts this sense of panic when people, crushed by this political storm, lost not only their ability to act, but also to think. It was like a blow to the very foundations of the U.S. identity, because for many of these people, the country where everything had its own system and order seemed like a different place. Through the experiences of ordinary people, Moore conveys a picture of the all-encompassing fear that gripped the nation. The feeling of helplessness that swept the country resembled a sense of complete despair. There was nowhere to run and no one to help. People were confronted with a political reality that seemed to exist only in their worst nightmares, and perhaps it was even worse than their worst fears.
I also think that Donald Trump is a big believer in capitalism and free enterprise and the sort of thing that's driven us into the ground, this belief that you could just do whatever you want and it doesn't matter who gets hurt by it. And I don't really see him changing, but I think he knows he's been on TV, you know, I mean, he's a...
Michael Moore continues to assert with his usual fervor that Trump will ultimately face the consequences of his reckless self-rule. According to him, there will come a moment when the White House will be filled not only with secretaries with mops, but also with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, armed deputies, and bailiffs to put an end to his dictatorial ambitions. And this, according to Moore, will not be just physical intervention, but a real awakening for Trump. A moment of realization that he no longer lives in his fantasy world where he can give orders as he pleases. Moore is so optimistic about the future that he even points out how the Supreme Court will slightly, but not completely, cover for Trump. Even though no matter how much he puffs himself up, his power is not absolute. In the end, both the military and Congress can still intervene and show Trump that playing games with democracy is not a sport he can win. Moore reminds us that there are women, black people, and Muslims in the military, and they are probably not very happy with their new colleague in the form of a president who seems more interested in self-praise than real work. But Republicans, according to Moore, apparently haven't realized that their days in the Trump sunshine are about to end. Moore sarcastically states that Republicans still don't understand what consequences await them in the future. It's like continuing to drink from a cup that doesn't seem to be cracking yet, but everyone knows that sooner or later it will break. In addition, Moore wistfully reminds us that it is liberals and progressives who have always won the fight for freedom and equality in American history. And if anyone can save the country from destruction, it is these heroes of civil rights, women's rights, and workers' rights who will willingly lead the country out of tyranny once again. He has no doubt that the moment has come when America will once again find itself at a crossroads, and everything will depend on those who are not afraid to say stop to dictatorship. The moral of this story is that self-confidence and ignoring the consequences of one's actions, especially at the level of political power, sooner or later lead to destruction. It is important to remember that even the strongest positions can prove shaky if they are not backed by honesty, respect for democratic principles, and a willingness to listen to society. History teaches us that true strength lies not in destruction, but in the ability to reflect on oneself and take into account the interests of all people, as well as in the importance of resisting injustice and defending the values of freedom and equality.
They're doing great. We were being ripped off by every country in the world virtually, and now we're not being ripped off anymore. It's very simple, very, very